welcome everybody to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Today we are here to talk about two new books on policing. Before we get into that, just make sure you take a second, like the video, share the video with folks on your social media, whatnot. After you watch it, share it again, remind people to come in. And if you have not subscribed to our channel yet, make sure to do that. I know about half the people who watch these every time aren't subscribers. And so it would be great for people to subscribe so they could just be at least aware of all the content that we have coming out. It's a lighter week this week. This is the only conversation we're having this week, but next week we're going to be back with, I think, 4 or 5 different live streams. So we'll have a whole lot going on next week as well. And yeah, I think that's all I'll say at this point, other than, of course, you can support us on Patreon or by becoming a member of the channel. Good morning to all the folks in the chat. Good to see you. Good to see you. Good to see you. So today we're having a live conversation on two new books on policing, as I said. One is by Melayna K. Lamb, and the other is by Tia Trafford. So Melayna's book is called a Philosophical History of Police Power, which I thought was just a really interesting thing for us to delve into. It's not something that we've delved into. Really, we've done a lot of stuff on abolition and on policing over the years, but thinking about the philosophy and the philosophy specifically of kind of the concept of police power, I thought was an interesting intervention that I wanted to dig into. And then the other book we're talking about is Everything is Police, in which Tia argues that policing is constitutive of colonial modernity, normalizing, internalizing, and legalizing anti-Black violence as the ongoing condition for white life and freedom. And so I'll just say quickly about our guests, and then I'll get into the first question and welcome them to the show, and they can say a little bit more about their projects and themselves. But Melayna Lamb is a lecturer at the University of Law London. Her work spans the intersections of political philosophy, Black studies, and critical legal thought, and is concerned with questions of police sovereignty, law, and state violence. She is also the co-author of the book Policing the Pandemic, published by Bristol University Press. Tia Trafford is reader in philosophy and design at the University of Creative Arts. They are currently working at the intersections of political theory and philosophy of race, anti-Blackness, policing, and freedom. They are the author of Everything is Police, which we're discussing today, The Empire at Home, Internal Colonies, and the End of Britain, and Meaning in Dialogue. They are also the co-editor of Alien Vectors, Acceleration, Exofeminism, Inhumanism, and Speculative Aesthetics. So welcome both of you to the show. It's great to be in conversation with you both. I said I was going to read short bios, and then I read the whole bios, but that'll save you from having to introduce anything else. Yeah, so I thank you for noting this. I will just echo this thing from the chat that folks should check out. Black Power Media had a recent conversation on Leonard Peltier and with his lawyer family and friends. And so always we do want to uplift the struggles of political prisoners towards freedom. So just thank you for noting that. So let's get into these books. So, I think it'd be useful, since we have the two of you on here and we're talking about two different books, but they're books I should say you all said, hey, let's be in conversation together. So I appreciated that. They're books that you're both interested in putting in conversation with each other, to talk a little bit about. So I thought it'd be useful to talk a little bit about kind of the projects themselves and their origin stories. You're both based in the UK. So that's part of the story of these books that might be a little bit different, but still very related to books on policing that people may have read in recent years that have been written in a U.S. context. Obviously, there's been a lot with, the movements against police violence, the Black Lives Matter movement, how broadly people might want to think about that, and kind of police abolition. in recent years that has led to also a number of interventions on policing in the US context. So say a little bit about what drew you each to writing these books and what specific interventions you were interested in making with them. Melayna, if you want to start, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. Um, so my book actually started as my PhD thesis, and I started writing it, I realized almost a decade ago, which is kind of scary to think about. But yeah, I guess what drew me to this project in particular, or thinking about police in this way, was kind of wanting to think about police power, but not think about it in terms of like a sociology of the police or just like a institutional history of the police, which I think are very common when talking about police power, right? There's a kind of reduction of it to, yeah, thinking about its institutional history in a particular jurisdiction, right, in a particular national context, or you think about it in terms of like, a kind of more sociological register, so kind of like documenting what police power does, like how it, affects people differently, by kind of documenting, like the number of stop and searches on particular communities and so on. And I think none of that seemed to me like sufficient to kind of account for police power and what it is and what it does. And I got really interested in like what philosophers had said about the police, or importantly what they had not said. And I found that a really interesting way in to think about what police power is, because there was so much philosophical work in the Western canon on sovereignty, for example, and law. So many major texts that are seen as like keystones for thinking about the modern state in philosophy, but very little that talked about police specifically or connected police power to those questions of sovereignty and law. And I thought that that was a really interesting kind of gap or omission in these texts, that they didn't really think about police. And when they did, it was kind of in passing, right? And it was this kind of like, oh yeah, there's this thing, there's this institution called the police, or there's this thing, police power, and isn't that a thing that we do? But like, we're not really going to talk about it, right? The main interest has always been kind of sovereignty in the state. Um, and yeah, I thought that was kind of an interesting problem in and of itself. And so that drew me to kind of thinking about, yeah, police as a philosophical, or what police power is in a philosophical register, and how that can help us to understand police power and how it operates today. Um, and I'm sure I will go on to talk more about that. But yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Tia.
Thanks, and thanks so much for inviting me on to chat. Um, and yeah, I mean, it's been really lovely getting to know Melayna. Actually, I think this is worth saying. The projects were developed completely separately, and then we found that there's considerable overlap, and so I've had like a lot of chat since, and been working on some stuff together and things like that, and it's quite interesting. I think, in part at least, the drive towards this book is coming from similar place, in that there's a lot of work on the police, particularly in the UK, that is sociological or historical. And that this work is very good, and it has, there's kind of some excellent work that kind of goes back to Stuart Hall and things like that, right? So excellent work, but that work isn't engaging with some of the more abstract problems of policing. And when I was thinking about trying to articulate the role of policing, and particularly thinking about the relationship between police and race, and I'd written this book on internal colonization in Britain, right? And in that book, I was trying to kind of break down the standard kind of divide between what supposedly developed as a very humane form of policing in the UK, in distinction even in the same moment, as a very violent form of policing in the colony. And I was trying to break down that distinction and think about the sort of reverberations rather than a sort of boomerang effect. And really just pushing further along that trajectory. And then in reading work coming through, particularly Black studies, there's something I think really important about the work that's being done in US Black studies, particularly, which opens up these questions into the domain of philosophy and particularly into the domain of like political ontology. And that seemed it just sort of kind of took me on this journey to start thinking much more about how policing is embedded, and that violence is embedded in ways that perhaps that tracing of origins and that kind of stuff doesn't quite get to. And also thinking about the kind of desires and libidinal energies involved in policing, and the way that that we are all kind of invested in these things in some way. So yeah, so this is just a kind of a continuation, but I guess a sort of journey on from work that I'd been doing before, but absolutely attempting to kind of think about policing and think about policing in a British context, but particularly thinking with like trying to think about what it would mean to kind of not just begin with the slave and the plantation and policing in that way, but to stay with the plantation, and to think about the way that the plantation kind of concretizes new social forms that take root in the organizing features of the human. This is like Sylvia Wynter, who's very influential. So kind of moving beyond historical origins to think about how these things became embedded within like the codes of the world, so to speak.
Yeah, right on. And I mean, I think that's a good kind of that kind of leads into the next question, because I think that there's one of the things I noticed in both of your projects in their own way, that they kind of eschew a notion of policing strictly as an instrument of like class power and class oppression. And it's not to say that you all don't include any of that analysis in your text or engage with authors who look at it that way, because you do. Um, but part of it is kind of what you were just talking about, Tia, um, is this attention to anti-blackness as a kind of specific animating logic of policing, and this shows up in your book as well, Melayna, especially. I mean, both anti-blackness and as Tia was just talking about, colonialism as well, but like this, the way Africa is looked at by people like Hegel, for instance, and things like this. Um, so I guess my question would be, kind of what did you find lacking in analyses of policing or police power that focus on it more so as kind of this instrument of class power in a kind of typical, we could say Marxist, sense of like, this is an instrument of the ruling class of bourgeois society to repress, the workers and things like that. What are the dynamics that each of you think that view doesn't fully account for?
Should I go? Um, yeah, I mean, I definitely don't like disagree with those kind of Marxist analyses at all. Like, I think that a lot of that work is really important, and like someone whose work that I engage with extensively as well is Mark Neoclaus, who is definitely coming at this problem of police power from a Marxist perspective. And for him, police power is the power to fabricate order, but that order is like the bourgeois order of wage relations, right? And I think that's like super important and illuminating in lots of ways. But perhaps where I see it as kind of where it kind of runs up against a limit again, I guess, for me, is this idea of gratuitous violence that you find in people like Frank Wilderson, um, I think that that idea of police power as kind of protecting private property or like ensuring the smooth functioning of capital can't really explain, yeah, the gratuitousness of the violence meted out against Black people, not only in the US but in the UK context as well. And I think, yeah, one of the things that me and Tia have discussed a lot, I guess it comes up a lot, right, that this idea of the British police being like, oh, you know, they're like an example of like good policing compared to American policing, which is like super violent, super racist, and like super excessive, right? British policing is kind of positioned as being a sort of humane, almost alternative to that, and I would completely reject that, right? Like there's huge issues with racism and particularly the policing of Black people in the UK, and there's a long history of that as well, that we could talk about. But yeah, I don't think that this this kind of Marxist analysis can necessarily explain the gratuitousness, the frequency, and indeed the kind of the way that the anti-Black policing or police violence is sort of global, the global nature of it as well, right? So it's not just a problem in the US and the UK, but also countries in Europe as well. And I guess that's where I'm trying to think about this logic of police power that that can be discerned in those contexts, but also beyond just the kind of standard story about them being an instrument of class domination, which like I said, of course they are as well. But I think there's a limit to that which can't necessarily explain why police can kill Black people in particular and it not have any kind of like, well, what De Silva calls like an ethical crisis. It doesn't precipitate an ethical crisis, and also why, you know, again and again in a court of law, those actions are deemed lawful, right? You know, even when the violence is quote unquote excessive, right? It's all, again and again seen as something that can be considered lawful. And I'm not sure that the traditional Marxist story necessarily can explain that so well.
Yeah, similar. I mean, this is pretty. Yeah, just kind of building on what Melayna's saying, and also the impetus for the book, like this, thinking about like, you know, there's a lot of work on this, like tracing the origins of the police. So like this, and there's partly this is motivated by, I think largely motivated by a concern with like thinking about racialized police violence, and then so tracing the sort of circulations of police and control across colony and metropole, plantation, and into the contemporary. And this is very important, and this is obviously good, like very, very important work, and particularly important. You know, it's still important. Even now we're thinking about the way in which, for example, like Israel is trialing weapons in Gaza, and that are training police forces, and that we have this kind of circulation of ongoing imperialist violence and struggle, right? I think, but like similarly to Melayna, I was interested in not just then thinking like, okay, so like yes, policing is clearly a constant in capitalist society, but there's a few issues. There's a few issues with thinking about that, like break. So like there's very little work thinking about like what is the move from like pre-capitalism to capitalism? Are we importing the sort of Marxist break between the like capitalism and slavery, which relies on a very specific articulation of slavery, which is necessarily kind of ended in order for capitalism to become possible? And like what happens to policing in that story? Does tracing the origins of policing necessarily tell us like why policing is like still has this, like Melayna says, like why we still see such anti-Black violence, and why that violence is seemingly gratuitous, and I think, yeah, of course, thinking about the way in which police protect and produce systems of exploitation and inequality is incredibly important, and it just doesn't seem to explain the universality of Black policing, and that's the key question for me, and like also Ronaldo Walcott, I think, is really important for my work, and he similarly is asking like this question about why and how is policing a seemingly sort of normal, almost mundane part of Black life. So it seems like we need to kind of ask questions about how policing is entrenched prior to when we, supposedly capitalist origins occur, and think about how there are kind of like tensions and continuing social forms. Again, like thinking about how, like Sylvia Wynter here, and the way in which like life in the global north is still reliant upon imperial expansion, anti-Black violence, in this kind of world that's been made that's hostile for Black people in the same moment that it is absolutely dependent upon Blackness materially and conceptually, and that like managing that tension seems to be built in far prior to the kinds of origin stories around capitalism that we are often told.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Just wanted to note for our audience, I put this in the chat, but we did interview Ronaldo Walcott back in 2021 on two of his books. One was On Property, Policing Prisons and the Call for Abolition, and the other was The Long Emancipation, Moving Toward Black Freedom. And really appreciate his work as well, and those books in particular, but just him as a thinker. So, one of the things that both of you ultimately kind of deal with through European philosophers is this relationship between their concepts of freedom and policing. And I found this to be really interesting because, I mean, on a sort of my own basic thinking around this, right, is that like they would sort of assume um, that there would be an antagonistic relationship between these things, right? That like I mean, certainly I think there is, right? But like I would sort of think that even somebody who's like some European philosopher would sort of think like, well, sort of through the concept of this is like a necessary evil to some degree to but it is an impingement upon freedom, and so we have to keep it really under wraps, tight, and stuff like that. And maybe to some degree, Melayna, like I know you delve into this quite a bit in your book, but maybe part of it is that they don't think about it as much as they really should, kind of as you referenced earlier on. Um, anyways, it seems to both of you it's quite clear that in reading the works of folks like Hegel and Kant and others, that they see policing as actually, or I should say, this was my read from the book, that they see these things as quite fundamental to freedom. That like the policing is actually sort of produces freedom in some way, and so yeah, I mean that was just kind of my reflection. I'm curious, Melayna, maybe you start us off because you spent a little bit more time with kind of Hegel and some of these figures in the book, but I know that you both are kind of engaging with this.
Yeah, so I think Hegel's really important for this question. And what I spend some time in the book doing is kind of talking about Hegel's critique of Fichte, who Hegel has like a real in like quite a funny spat with in like a range of his texts. So he's talking about Fichte and how Fichte kind of talks about this problem of police. So basically for Fichte, the police and by extension the state should know who every citizen is and where they are at all times, and he like goes to great lengths to kind of detail about how this can come about, right? Because if you know who every citizen is and where they are at all times, then crime, like no one will commit crime because there is no chance of them escaping being caught, essentially, right? So this is like the ultimate like preventative police power. And he talks about how everyone needs to have these passports where they like say, you know, this is where I am and this is where I'm going next, and it has to be like authorized, and it's like really weird thing. And Hegel is like really annoyed by this conceptualization of police, and is like, this isn't like whatever Fichte's doing here. It's not philosophy, right? This isn't real philosophy. He's just like getting caught in this like infinite loop of detail, essentially like unnecessary detail, but also that he thinks this necessarily results in a kind of a limitless bounding of freedom, because ultimately, yeah, like if you have to kind of have your moves constantly supervised and surveilled by this like all-knowing, all-seeing state, then this for Hegel is not freedom, right? Your freedom is kind of being constricted and bounded in this way. So Hegel, it's worth saying, thinks that the state is the actualization of freedom. So the only way that an individual can be free is through being a member of a state, right? There's no other way for an individual to be actually free. So that's worth saying at the beginning. Hegel also agrees with Hobbes about the state of nature. He disagrees with Hobbes about lots of things, but he agrees with Hobbes that like without a state, human nature is this kind of like naturally violent thing where people would just, yeah, like it would be chaos and disorder, and people would be like fighting each other and killing each other and all this stuff, right? So when he's talking about Hobbes, he's like, Hobbes got that right about the state of nature and why we need a state, but what he gets wrong is the state as this kind of dominating force, right? And Hegel's like, the state should not be seen or construed as like a dominating force. Rather, the state is the condition for freedom, individual freedom, to be possible at all. It's not something that dominates us. It's not something that impinges or undermines our freedom. It's the condition of possibility for freedom. And so I think police are a really come in a really interesting way for Hegel, where he's like, yeah, like, so there's this like all, you know, kind of totalitarian state that Fichte's kind of depicting, and this is wrong because it bounds freedom. And actually what we need is like a police that can supervise the goings on in civil society, but is not really seen to be doing so. So if Hegel's like, it's okay to have like secret police that are just like monitoring things in the background, but don't be too obvious about it, right? Like don't be like really obvious about it. And in this way, like this is how we can have both, you know, our cake and eat it, basically, for Hegel, right? And I found that really interesting because I think it's really similar to like contemporary arguments, you know, like Western liberal democracies talking about you know, states that are supposedly liberal and democratic, and counterposing those to like authoritarian states, right? And it's interesting, it's like, you know, we're still going to engage in like really violent activities. We're still going to like surveil people, use like undercover policing to like suppress dissent and to suppress protests and to suppress activism and all of these things. But like, as long as we're like not openly kind of doing it in a way that is like openly despotic or authoritarian, right? Rather, what the police, or what we're told that the police are doing, is like making it possible for people to live their lives, right? They are the condition for order and therefore freedom in the first place. And so anything they do is then not is supposedly then not construed as being like despotic and an impingement on our freedom. So I think that's like kind of it's an interesting way that kind of Hegel's going about this, right? He's saying like, yes, like freedom, but also we need to be careful because civil society could collapse into like a Hobbesian state of nature, and we need to like ward that off, right? And we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. And one of the ways that we do that is by having police. So it's like police, not authoritarian, like the condition for freedom, but like they're still going to engage in some of those activities that he's also criticizing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I just want to note for the audience, I mean, one of the things I found really fascinating about this too is like they're having these conversations in like, the late 17, early 1800s, right? So it's like this is like I don't know. I don't even in sometimes I don't even think of police as being much of an institution at that point in time, and yet they're like thinking about like a full scale surveillance state. And so anyways, that's just it's interesting in some ways how, like you said, how resonant that is with kind of current discussion sometimes around surveillance and things like that. That they would be thinking about this stuff that long ago and in those types of ways. And so yeah, Tia, go ahead. I know you talk about Kant quite a bit, but I don't know where you want to take this, but you're welcome to take it wherever you would.
Yeah, I was going to take it to Kant. And yeah, I mean, with Kant, I am thinking about policing rather than like the institution of the police. And I think, one of the things that I'm suggesting in the book is that Kant's kind of emphasis on reason, I guess, is that it is actually a kind of it sort of covers over a whole load of things which are effectively like the requirement that we are endlessly like policing ourselves and others as well, right? So like just to kind of roll that back a little bit. So for Kant, like freedom is defined in terms of autonomy. So this is like a twofold account of freedom. Basically, it requires that we are not determined by nature, either externally or internally, and it requires also that we are bound to law. So this is the nomos bit of autonomy. That law has to be law of our own making. That's the auto bit. So we need to we're binding ourselves to laws of our own making. This allows us to be free, right? And in order to bind ourselves to those laws, we have to know that those laws come from reason rather than somewhere else. And that somewhere else could be like inclination or desire, or like, I don't know, being swayed by or like externally through like a master or something, like that. So you have this situation where effectively the slave is interestingly like hovering in the background, like in order to make it into the domain where you can begin to like set your own laws. You have to be the sort of being that is not possibly enslaved, right? And Kant spends some time kind of thinking about this and looking at these issues, particularly in like relation to Rousseau, whose argument, Rousseau's famous argument is that you can't choose to like voluntarily enslave yourself, and Kant's quite interested in this kind of problematic, right? Sean Capener writes on this, and is excellent in case anyone wants to follow that up. So freedom is then sutured to order, but it's also become sutured to kind of like an ordering condition, right? We have to make sure that we are kind of both nurturing our rationality, but also decreasing the power of anything that lies beyond it. And there's an anxiety built into this as well, because how can you be sure that your will is like a will that is arising through reason? How can you be certain that your will is even your own will? in the first place. So you have to kind of like annex off that anxiety somewhere. And Kant spends a lot of time, I think, like trying to show that Europeans are kind of exempted from the sorts of anxieties, right? So sort of exempted from like the state of nature, for example, that exists prior to freedom and law, so that those things can be secure for us. And then the other side of the coin to this is that for Kant, Black people are forever in the state of nature. They're like inescapably in the state of nature, and so become seen as the kind of nadir. The positioned as almost like an antithesis, as antithesis to like the lawful subject. But also he talks about how simply in their existence, they like threaten our capacity to kind of have our like safe European haven of law and lawfulness. So you've got blackness performs this kind of twofold function then for Kant, which is in one sense, it's like the offstage thing that like the European cannot be, and therefore like we don't need to be anxious about that, because it's the sort of nadir of humanity. And on the other hand, also it's like an infinite threat to our kind of lawful free existence. So in this sense, like what is freedom really, I guess, for Kant then, is it's it requires us to be policing ourselves. We need to like police ourselves against the kind of possible insurgency of like our internal nature, and desire and inclination taking over reason. It also requires that we have mastery over those who could never adequately bind themselves to reason, and these things then are kind of both, I think, central to Kant's thought, but also like unthinkable by Kant. So yeah, like kind of like Melayna was saying earlier, like it's there's something which is like necessary for Kant's thought to cohere around, but is almost for the same reason unthinkable. And I think there's this phrase that Anthony Farley uses to talk about the space of like kind of reason, basically, as the form of repressed desire and violence. And I really liked this. I thought this was excellent way of thinking about what reason ends up being in Kant. So we cannot be sure if we are reasoning according to these laws of our own making. We can't be sure if the will through which we are reasoning is our own will, even. So you end up in this position where you're kind of just like fighting these anxieties and constantly policing these things.
Yeah, I found it really interesting just in both of your books, the degree to which, um, I mean, I'm not somebody who reads a lot of European philosophy, and so the degree to which there is this one, the anxiety also, which maybe we'll get to later, but if not, you're welcome to say some things now. But like there's an anxiety around savagery, and then there's like kind of what you were just talking about, Tia, in terms of like Africa or Black people like representing the state of nature. Obviously is something that you both sort of have to reckon with in writing these books, in terms of how, because it's like, I don't know, I mean, I think of, you know in many ways, I think of indigenous societies as much closer to an expression of freedom, at least pre-colonialism, than I would think of as, a colonial society. And yet, it's like that idea, Melena, that you also said, of just sort of like without a state, people can't be free. Um, I don't know. Anyways, I found those insights really interesting within their thought as like, I mean, obviously we've done a lot of discussion over the years on this podcast on imperialism and colonialism, but like those like fundamental problems within European philosophy, um, that yeah, I mean, seem to be very based in kind of an anxiety, too, and also kind of what you were talking about, Tia, the sort of like self-absorption in their own um kind of thought and society, and the need to sort of define it as superior and more free. I don't. Anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because when Hobbes talks about the state of nature, this is like frequently cited as him thinking about what life before the state was like, right? Like, so how did we how did we end up building a state? Um, what was life before the state like? And he comes up with this idea of the state of nature, which is incredibly violent, like this pervasive threat of violence that's kind of constantly hanging over us, and then we constantly have to defend ourselves violently, right, in order to survive. And it's positioned as like a thought experiment, right, like what was life like before the state? But actually Hobbes is writing in the context of the English Civil War, and he's very much talking about the state of nature as something that can reappear. And I think this is a really important point. It's not something that is like, oh, we built the state and then we overcame the state of nature and now it's like not a concern, right? It's super important in like animating state violence, because it's like this is what we have to like prevent from happening, is like this fall into this abyss of chaos, which is the state of nature. But it's a constant, ever-present threat, right? And I think this is what kind of then gives justification to any and all violence that the state then enacts, right? Because it's like this is what we're trying to like stave off, is this state of nature, which is kind of, it could just be around the corner constantly. And you sort of see that a little bit, not so much, but a little bit in Hegel as well, where he's talking about civil society, because of the ever-present existence of poverty, as always being on the verge of collapse as well. Like there's kind of like this anxiety about these structures falling, for sure. And like this is where I see police power coming in, right? It's like, here's this institution that has the job of like using violence to supposedly repel the violence of the state of nature, but of course in so doing incorporates the violence, this like extreme, like unaccountable violence in those institutions themselves, right? The state is like the violence of the state of nature, if you will, but in an institutional form, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. So another figure that you both deal with is Michel Foucault. It's not surprising. He's someone whose work is very influential around, kind of theories and philosophy related to policing, as well as, of course, prisons. For each of you, perhaps you could say, a bit about kind of where you depart from Foucault, because each of you are kind of dealing with different aspects of where you see his work to have issues that kind of don't allow it to fully explain policing or police power. Tia, you could start this time since.
Okay, thanks. And actually, what is quite funny, because I wasn't even going to mention Foucault in the book. Actually, it was quite late on into writing, and I think I'd had a conversation with Melayna about Foucault, and she was saying how like every time she brings up the idea of what she's writing about, everyone's like, "Oh, you're doing Foucault." And I was like, I was like, okay. I realized at this point that this would be an immediate response, particularly because I'm talking about like everything as police, and then you can understand that as a kind of dispersal, that like policing is like just dispersed across the social rather than concentrated in like institutional form and stuff like that. and so I begrudgingly put in a little, just a few paragraphs, but I think it is useful and important because like you say, Foucault's been so influential. And actually, we just wrote a piece together on Foucault for the same reason. So I think, there's like quite a few areas of depart. I mean, I do think Foucault is important and useful, and there's done, like is people using Foucault for very good work. I think there are real limitations, though. I think like one of the major limitations, to be completely simplistic, is like Foucault's analysis of power does not really talk about power. And I think that this is when we're thinking about what the police is, this is quite important. So power for Foucault, we're talking about particularly the late Foucault, which I think is the picture of Foucault that people are really drawing on when they're thinking about this like dispersal of policing. So the idea that like we have a sort of social world in which power is like nowhere like concentrated, something like not concentrated in any single person's hands. I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's sort of channeling people's behavior and moving us in a certain direction is like creating sort of tendencies and things like that, and flows and channels and this kind of stuff. And obviously, to some degree, I think this is very good and like true. This is set up in antagonism to the idea of the sovereign, of course. This is Foucault's whole picture. And so it's set up in like antagonism to, although there's some debate about this, whether or not it's supposed to take over or be coterminous or, and actually maybe it's a little bit more complex than this, but there's just seem like there's the analysis of power is one that that is set to, it's like a hierarchical, it's concentrating on kind of repressing, not repressing, like the opposite of repressing disorder in the institution of the police, and more in like self-policing, the way in which our behaviors are sort of channeled and stuff like that. So why do I disagree? There's a few places. Like one is I don't think this can explain murder at the hands of the police, to be really blunt. So Joy James has a critique of Foucault, which I think is really important here. And she's asking like what happens to those people who are not even like seen by Foucault in this story, who are kind of so I'm rolling back again. So the ticket to entry into the realm of power for Foucault is that we are free. We have to be free in order to be part of this domain in which our in which like power is like circulating around us, right? So power and freedom are like coterminous in this sense. And like one of the things that Joy James is pointing to is suggesting, well, what happens to those who are not free? What happens if we think about the slave, right? And Foucault says that the slave relation is not one of power, that power relation is only possible insofar as we are free. And so we're subject to power insofar as we're not slaves. You have to have this sort of base level of freedom. So Joy James is asking, like, what happens then to those who are outside, who seem to be outside, that seem to be rendered non-existent? How do we understand then the kind of the way that police and policing operates, if it is simply supposed to kind of circulate through all of us? And I think, like, in part, I would read this as the kind of overhang of Foucault's reliance on Kant. I think like actually Foucault is kind of like the evil version of Kant in a sense, although Kant's obviously evil. But like like Foucault is radicalizing Kant.
You're gonna annoy a lot of people by saying that, I think.
Not gonna annoy me. That's fine.
No, you're right, aren't you? Yeah, okay. I'm just gonna not check my email for a few days. So, in the same way that I was kind of talking about the way earlier that for Kant, you have effectively blackness is this space of like total incapacity, which has to be like it's required to mark out the domain of the social, but it has to be off stage because it cannot actually exist within the domain of the actual, but you need it to mark out what's required to even enter the domain. And I think that this is rehearsed. This is effectively rehearsed in Foucault, and you can kind of see that in some of the arguments around critique as voluntary and servitude and things like that. But it's like it would take a while to get into the like the fine grained aspects of the arguments. You have to wait for our paper. But basically, it's like I think that like following George James, you have to have this exterior that must be disavowed. Even whilst it's required to make the space of power coherent. And this is what Foucault then can't deal with. But Foucault basically cannot deal with the slave at the level of political ontology rather than at the level of discourse. This would be the kind of argument. And so then the argument is not that we've moved from sovereign power to dispersed power, for me at least, but rather that like police is necessary to manage the emergence of a specific form of the world and the way that violence is internalized within it. And then the institution of the police is very much bound up with sovereignty, and is operating at like the cutting edge of policing, where the policing is the form of this world. It's operative at the threshold of its kind of endless, the attempt to kind of the endless like attempt to make it cohere, I guess. And this like kind of related to what Melayna was saying earlier in terms of Hobbes, this like endless, the endless kind of possibility of chaos. And also just thinking here with like Jared Sexton, who talks about the police as the avant-garde of white supremacy. It was a very long answer. Sorry about that.
No, that's good. Yeah, Melayna.
Yeah, I mean, like Tia said, when I started my PhD and I told people I was writing about philosophy and the police, everyone was like, "Oh, so you're writing about Foucault," including my supervisors or advisors, as you call them in the US. And I was like, "No, I'm actually not." But people were very insistent about this for a long time. Anyway, so I did end up writing about Foucault in the book, but at the beginning to kind of say this is not an addition to like Foucauldian scholarship on the police, which, you know, there's a lot of, and became, you know, really popular. This idea of like biopolitics and policing as this kind of diffuse disciplinary power about like kind of managing flows and channels and networks and this kind of image of policing, which as Tia said, I mean, like to put it bluntly, cannot account for the police murdering people and yeah, specifically, like I guess like we could talk about like the racial aspect of that, but also the fact that Foucault is trying to get away from this idea of sovereignty, which is the sovereignty which he characterizes as the power to take life, which he says is kind of, again, there's like, it's slightly contradictory in Foucault's thought, right? You can't just say sovereignty disappears and in its place appears biopolitics, which is about making life live, as he says. So it's about like integrating like the vital dimensions of the population into like the logic of state power and stuff. And it's more about like how can we have a docile kind of healthy population, for example. He doesn't necessarily say that like one replaces the other, but there is in his work a logic of discontinuity between the two. So he's like, we need, you know, famously, we need to cut off the head of the king. Like we can't just like keep talking about power as sovereign power. Like there's other things going on here. And I think, yeah, again, that kind of glosses over or doesn't really deal with how police power relates to sovereign power, which is something that I'm very interested in. So if sovereign power is the power to take life, I see police powers as very much resting on that same foundation as sovereign power, right? The fact that a police officer can kill and it not be considered a crime. This is exactly how sovereign power has been characterized. This ability to kill and it not be considered a crime. So I don't think you can get to that relationship via Foucault very well. I think because he has this logic of discontinuity. And I think as well, he kind of assumes that, particularly, you know, the later writings when he's talking about order and he's talking about, you know, this idea of natural order kind of reappearing again in kind of liberal political economic thought. And he's talking about how there was a limit placed on state power when liberalism comes along, because they're like, the state should no longer be like interfering in the economy, right? So there's like a natural order that comes out of Adam Smith, who's talking about the natural order of like exchange and trade, and that this somehow places a limit on what the state can do and to which areas it can interfere. And so necessarily Foucault kind of sets up this idea of natural order as limiting state power, whereas I think my point is that actually state power, or more specifically police power, is actually what creates order, or rather what allows us to make sense of a concept like order in the first place, right? Like if a police officer says, you know, that something is disorderly, or public order is being transgressed in some way, then that makes it so, right? Like that means that then they're going to act accordingly. And it's very, very difficult to dispute that. So I think there's an kind of an almost like an uncritical acceptance of this idea of natural order limiting state power that I find deeply unhelpful when it comes to thinking about police as well.
I really appreciate that. And I mean, I'm thinking like this morning, you know, there's the folks in the US would probably be aware of this. Maybe you are as well, but there's been this encampment at Columbia, right? And there's like a ton of, you know, I forget what their exact term is, but they're basically like the anti-terrorism unit of the NYPD that's been like all out. And then there's been other protesters that have been kind of um protesting basically to defend the encampment. So other people around the city that have been, you know, but uh obviously they've started arresting folks, and you know, solidarity to that. And I should say I think they've started arresting people that are outside of the encampment at this point. But again, like what you're talking about, of that, like, okay, this is an unlawful assembly, this is disorder, right? That ability to just sort of invoke that, and then there isn't really a check and balance of it. Of course, you know, in this case, obviously the people on the ground, you know, resisting it are to some extent, but you know, that in the law, in the terms of the law and the way society looks at it, it is like kind of there's not some, you know, check or balance within the system of that form of power. So that kind of leads into this next question, which Melayna is directed for you. Tia, it's okay if you have additional thoughts on this as well. But Melayna, there's a specific focus you have in the book around the concepts of order and sovereignty and the relationship that these concepts have toward policing. You spend a couple of chapters on this, and I don't expect you to go through a detailed explanation here in the same way you do in the book, because this is a good chunk of the book. But could you share some of the concerns here around these concepts as they relate to the philosophy of police power?
Sure, yeah. So I think, yeah, in terms of order specifically, I find it a really interesting concept because it's an empty concept, right? That then gets filled with like various things. But ultimately, usually when we think about order, it's in an oppositional relation with disorder. Like order is the absence of disorder, I suppose, would be a kind of simplistic way of putting it. And I think that that emptiness is what allows it to be. It's well, it's really important for like the history of Western thought, which I kind of track in the book as well via Agamben, and it's this concept which um, is taken up by not only the ancient Greeks but Christian theologians as well, to explain the relationship between, well, for theologians it would be the relationship between like a transcendent God who sits above the world, and the way that God acts in the world, and the relationship between those two things, right? Because there's a gap that appears between the transcendent God who exists above the world and their activity in the world. Because God is not actually in the world acting, there needs to be a relationship or a mediation between those two things, and this is where order comes in via a notion of divine providence. I won't go too much into that there, but what I think this sets up is a kind of political architecture that we can see operating in the relationship between sovereignty and government. Again, this is via Agamben, but I'm thinking about, yeah, how sovereignty is this kind of power that is transcendent and exists, above, if you will, but then has to be mediated with the world itself, and the activity and the action that's going on in the world itself. And again, I think order is a very malleable concept that allows that mediation to happen because it's empty, right? It doesn't have any positive content in it specifically. So Agamben kind of talks about it as mediating transcendence and immanence. And then I think about that in relation to police power specifically because police do have the power to invoke the concept of order as a justification for what they're doing, right? So the idea that police uphold or maintain order is obviously a common way of like thinking about what the police are and what they do. Law and order is like obviously the most famous kind of pairing. So it's obviously crucial, but also the kind of the emptiness of the concept, the vagueness, and the kind of, it's how malleable it is, allows it to be this thing that can be invoked to justify police violence and police power and its execution in the world, um through kind of legal things like public order, which in the UK is like the powers relating to public order are so vague and wide, right? Like they're like really anything could be characterized as a disturbance of public order, right? There's so many different ways that it can be utilized in that way, right? It's some anything like that causes harassment, alarm, or distress, and now it's like things that are too noisy is a transgression of public order. Like all these things where ultimately, if the police say that it's a transgression of public order, it would be very, very difficult for anyone to dispute that. And indeed, of course, we can just look at like the court records to know that most of the time it will be accepted that what the police say order is what it is. So there's that kind of element, and then sovereignty, I think, again, like I've been saying, this ability to kill and it not be considered a crime, which is traditionally how sovereign power has been conceived, is very much like how I would characterize police power as well. I don't think that power is contingent or incidental, or just like additional to what police power is. I think it's at the very core of what police power is. But what the police need to do, and I was kind of getting there with Hegel a bit, is they need to project a legitimizing foundational power that founds its own power so as not to seem arbitrary or despotic, right? So what police power needs is something that overarches and kind of sits above it and legitimizes it, but really is just the police projecting that, police power projecting that itself. And what I mean by that is, police power is so often thought of as secondary or derivative, right? It's something that comes sits below the law, it sits below state power or executive power. And I think what that, like, framing it in that way is to get it the wrong way around. And I think police power, in fact, projects sovereignty and law as that which founds it and legitimizes it, but which actually is its founding itself. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if I'm explaining it very well. So it's the kind of inverse relationship that isn't commonly thought of when we think of police power, that really it's yeah, it can use things like the public, right? So to justify its actions. Police can use order, the public, like these other kind of things that it projects as its own foundation. So we are doing this for the sake of the public, for the sake of public order, right? And then that gives a kind of mystical quality to police action that can then be considered, justified or legitimate or whatever. But really, which it's just like arbitrarily invoking to justify its own actions that it's kind of carrying out ad hoc, if you will.
Yeah, thanks for that, and I think we'll come back to that a little bit later. Uh, so Tia, in your chapter, which is titled "Property is a Plantation," you dig into some of the dynamics of racial capitalism as it relates to the development of policing and private property. Here you look at the slave plantation. You also look at indigenous genocide or extirpation, removal, and how these dynamics were linked to the development of private property as we know it today and the modern policing regime. In particular, you focus on, slavery and slave labor and labor in this arrangement. Could you say a bit more about what you were trying to elaborate here and some of the common representations you were seeking to displace or trouble a little bit with this intervention?
Yes. So thanks. I think this is a really useful question as well. One of the starting points that I find when we're thinking about property, even in like critique of property, and particularly thinking about like colonial property regimes and things like that. So critiquing property as a colonial project, we start with Locke often, right? So I wanted to think a little bit with Locke and think about the relationship between Locke and the plantation and slavery. And so with Locke, we have this, we're thinking with this sort of critique of the standard like Lockean view of property, which is you kind of you work the land and the land becomes yours effectively, right? And of course there's good critiques of this, like Robert Nichols's critique that property is theft, and obviously this includes in reality like land clearances and genocide and so on. Locke's justifying this by appeal to the idea of the state of nature again, and one of the things that he does is he argues not just that it's our like God-given right to make sure that to do this, but we are required by God to make sure the land is not wasted. And this idea of like the land would be wasted effectively if it's not worked by the colonizer, right? So effectively, we're then required by God to annihilate the state of nature in service of its metamorphosis into property, right? Now, and I think there's like this. The critique that has emphasized this stuff is good and important, but it does sometimes at least invisibilize the role of the slave in the consolidation of property, in the sense that it sees slaves as kind of simply like a reservoir of labor, right? So it buys into what Sara Maria Sorrentino and Tapji Garba are calling the labor theory of the slave. but when we think about the role of the slave, it was like another thing about the slave that's really important is that positioning slaves as property. So thinking about slaves as chattel under collective white control as well, which like the collective control of like white people in their policing. That is central to the making of white community. So to be part of civil society, and that's also to be part of the regime of property, is to be distinct from slaves. It's to be the sort of person who can own property rather than be the sort of being that is property, right? So Locke argues that the people in slavery are not capable of property, and then so they can't be part of civil society. And the whole point of civil society being like the preservation of property, the annihilation of the state of nature, like I say. So what's interesting here then is there's a tension between the drive to annihilation of the state of nature and the dependence of that drive on the labor of the slave in like making that land into property. So where we get to with this is a kind of protection of property and the property regime, which is constituted against this like disordering threat, the state of nature. But the slave is in the same moment made to embody that threat as the state of nature themselves. The slave is both then subject to property rights and the object of exclusion against incursion on those rights. And I think most importantly, like where land could supposedly be rescued from this like wasted state, even if that process is happening in reality through genocide and clearances and things like this, the slave represents a state of nature that's both irredeemable and essential to the liberal project, to this project of the property regime. And I think that tension is still operational. And I talk about that a little bit in the rest of that chapter. So if we think about emancipation, the period of emancipation as a kind of selling slaves to the state, so that their control could be distributed. If we think about like the way in which like the colony is used to subsidize property regimes, all the way through, you know, like formal decolonization. Think about then like thinking about like post-war Britain, for example. We're thinking about like the national limits on workers, the way that union activities is coalesced around like white workers, particularly in like after like post-war immigration movement, like 60s, 70s in Britain. But then even thinking more recently to things like nationalizing services, thinking about the way that we consider like supposedly radical movements like universal basic income, which are almost always not universal and also reliant on borders that facilitate unequal exchange. So I'm trying to kind of like think about how that tension might operate. If we think about that as a logic of property, as the logic of the plantation, as continued in this like sustained dependence upon those who are required to provide the resources for white accumulation, while simultaneously produced as kind of abject and incapable of property or being members of civil society.
Appreciate that. It reminds me a little bit, Stefano Harney and Fred Moten in their book All Incomplete work with this concept of usufruct, which is like an improving use. And the idea behind usufruct, as I understand it, is like you can own the property so long as you improve it. If you don't improve it, then it will be seized, right? And they connect this to just like property, but also like possession, right? And self-possession, right? And so then um the human, the person who can be human and can be free is the one who is engaged in a project of self-improvement through whatever improvement means, right? And those that are not interested in improving themselves, so in this sort of progressive, teleology or whatever, that those people then cannot possess themselves and so can then be possessed by someone else, which is where, for them, they connect then slavery, but also, connecting to land, they connect, indigenous genocide and land theft to this as well. And it's very interesting, because these are kind of even in the conversation we've had thus far about these concepts within European philosophy and like, the things that have to be in place in order for us to be free or in order to be better, and the ways that these are also very much inherently justifications of, things like slavery and settler colonialism and so on and so on. So I appreciate that. Um, so, Melayna, this comes back to kind of where I think we're starting to go in that last question, which is I'm really interested in hearing you talk a little bit about your formulation of police power as ultimately anarchic in character. So, yeah, if you could say a little bit more about this. This was an interesting thing. And first when I'm reading it, I'm kind of like, well, no, but I appreciate as you start to lay out, even in the last question that you responded to, kind of where you're going with that. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure, yeah. So obviously I don't mean anarchic in the, like political theory of anarchism style, but I'm rather thinking about anarchic. So Walter Benjamin talks about the bourgeois order being anarchic, exceedingly anarchic, which I really love that quote. I think it's really interesting. But yeah, I guess what I mean is anarchic as deriving from the Greek arche, which is like an origin or command, right? So it's deriving from an origin or command. So anarchic being as not deriving from an origin or command. And like you said in that last question, I was kind of trying to circle around that point, which is to say that I think police power. So there's a kind of really common narrative about police power, which is that in pre-modern times, so under like absolutism and the police state, that police power was essentially the execution of a sovereign will, or like the will of the monarch, right? Was expressed through a very broad, all-encompassing police power, which was kind of I guess meant something similar to what we would now call policy, right? So police power was kind of like responsible for like everything to do with the state and the people in it. So like for things like, setting the price of food to like what people should wear and like that they shouldn't swear and things like this. Like all of this came under this notion of police power. So we have this like supposedly very pre-modern, very broad pre-modern notion of police power, which is a direct kind of line from what the sovereign wants to how the people are governed, right, or what they should be doing. In modernity, supposedly, we have a modern police power, which is no longer the expression of a sovereign will, but is rather, as I was saying, the kind of upholding or enforcing a law that has already been made, right? So that we have this we have this relationship between police power and the law, where police power is secondary or derivative from the law, and they are simply there to uphold or enforce that law. Obviously, I know that you and everyone else listening knows that is clearly not the case, right? But I do think there's something to be said for how we understand the relationship of police to the law, which is not just to see them as it's not so in Walter Benjamin's terms, it's not just that they're founding the law, they're not just creating law, and they're not just preserving the law. Their violence doesn't just preserve the law, but rather that they have this kind of power to suspend the law, or they're kind of operating in this terrain outside of the law, but nevertheless have to have a connection to it. And I understand that through this idea of the state of exception that comes through Agamben. But I think like Agamben's kind of rendering of it, he sort of says like, oh, very in a very kind of like offhand throwaway way, like, oh, the police are like always operating in a similar state of exception to that of the sovereign or something, and then kind of just leaves it there and doesn't go on to talk about it. And I was like, hang on, wait, that seems like super important, right? And so this is where I kind of get to with how I think about it, is that the police are anarchic, so they're kind of operating in this zone which is not they're not just simply like creating law, they're not just like transgressing law, like breaking law, because so often when it comes to it, right, when police activity does appear in front of the law, which rarely, like, let's be real, like rarely it does, but when it does appear in front of the law often accommodates it, right, or says like, oh no, that was, what you did was lawful, not only with regard to police killings, but like other police activity as well. So that their activity is kind of rendered lawful or legitimate, at least, by those powers, but really they're not. We can't understand it as simply executing the law, or indeed, yeah, like when I understand the kind of impetus to try and say that like the police have broken the law, or that what they are doing is lawless, or like they've somehow transgressed the law. But I don't think that gets us very far as well, because of this relationship, like I said, that they have, where they're operating outside of the law, but the law will kind of retroactively accommodate that violence, or that activity, in order to legitimize it after the fact. And so that's why I think this idea of police power being anarchic is quite helpful in that sense. Like, we can kind of try and dispense with this idea that we can hold police power to account by or through the law. And we did a book launch the other day, and I spoke about that in relation to the activity, like, so the actions of Israel as well, right? Like, there's this understandable desire to kind of call what they're doing war crimes, or to say that like this goes against international law, and as if like the existence of the law itself doesn't presuppose a kind of unfettered violence that is deemed necessary, right, for self-defense or whatever, like defending either the state, so like within the state, which is what the police are doing, or like defending, the international community from like the barbarism of whatever, which then like legitimizes like, yeah, this like extreme violence that has no limits on it, but nevertheless is then kind of, yeah, it can be considered, like it can be accommodated by the law itself. I think, I don't think it exists in an antithetical relationship to it.
Yeah, I agree. Tia, there's also a concept of white destiny that you work with in your book, which has tensions. You write, quote, lead to an aporia that requires impossible sutures, end quote. So could you say a little bit more about what you mean by this? And also, like, for those of us who are not as deep into philosophy, just also explain what an aporia is, because I think that's sometimes something that gets thrown around and people don't actually know what it means.
Yeah. I mean, like, yeah, it's it depends who you're talking about. In this, I mean, here we're thinking about a tension or contradiction. Sometimes is an aporia can be something which is like a kind of whole that's almost like required to make things cohere. But that's a bit more abstract. But I think attention is probably like a easy, like a nice way of thinking about like attention that's not resolvable, I guess. And okay, yeah. So in terms of the idea of white destiny, this is part of what actually was motivating me to write the book, actually, which I didn't mention, which is this trying to like move away from the idea that the big problem with say like Western thought or philosophy and things like that, is that it's like it's a project of universalization, but that project is like necessary. It's partial because it's arising in Europe, and it universalizes from this thing, and then it kind of like imposes that universal on its others, right? And I find that to be just like wanting, I guess, as a story about like the problem, like what is the issue here, right? So thinking about this through Kant, I think is useful. Though I do talk about Hegel a little bit, but like I'm not a Hegel expert like Melayna is.
I'm
uh,
not either, but
I mean, you're just being modest. What was it? Wasn't it your examiner or something who said to you, "Did you actually read this book?" Who was that?
no, that was when I was doing my transfer. So when you go from like in the middle of your PhD, basically, they're like, yes, you can now be a proper PhD student. They call it the transfer here. And yeah, it was someone that was like reading my work and was like, I was talking about Hegel's philosophy of right, and he was like, have you actually read it? I was like, yes.
If that's all it takes to be an expert. But yeah, anyway. So with Kant, so like a big, like one of the big critiques of like Kant's like progressivist project, like the cosmopolitanist project in Kant, is that it's not very cosmopolitan, I guess. And the idea is that like, you know, the critique is that like non-European cultures are in reality going to be like assimilated under European ideals. So the critique is this idea that there's a universalization inherent in this project that basically rides roughshod over its others. So the problem is this like exclusion against a universal ideal, in which like the global like ordering of the world is one which becomes written as a kind of like white destiny, right? So it's a kind of play on this idea of a Kantian teleology, which is implicit in the kingdom of ends in Kant's work, right? So like whilst the kingdom of ends is supposed to be inclusive of all humans on Earth, it looks like there's a kind of a project in which we are effectively like universalizing from one perspective and like imposing that universal. But so like digging into what Kant is doing, it looks like things are a little bit more complicated than that. So Kant is saying that non-white people are not like consistent with that destiny. Kant writes about like the progression of the human species towards an end in which all races will be extinguished apart from that of the whites. So it seems like maybe it's not simply that we're kind of like, you know, universalizing and then excluding. Like so the reason why though that would lead to something like an aporia that requires this like endless and impossible suture is because Kant is also reliant upon blackness for the project to make sense, kind of like for the reasons that I was alluding to earlier. But we can read this more broadly, I think, in two ways. Like one through like David Marriott, I think is really important reading of Fanon's like Nest Pa, particularly with this. He argues that through Fanon we can think about blackness as the nothing that cannot appear in the world and yet is necessary for its coherence. And then we can think maybe about like whiteness as this project that's then required to make sense of a tension the tension between the drive to annihilate blackness and maintain blackness, as I was talking about earlier. You can think about this though in a more like materialist tradition as well, I think. So we think about like Amilcar Cabral talks about like this like tendency and drive of colonization towards black extinction, but that would create a void which, this is Cabral, sorry, a void which empties from foreign domination of its content and its objects, the dominated people, so effectively like exploding its own conditions of possibility. Like Fanon also cites Sartre and talks about the urge to destroy the colonized as amounting to the immediate destruction of colonization. So you have this tension between like the, you know, this drive but the completion of that drive would undermine the conditions through which the drive was put in place in the first place, right? So the reason why we have this like aporia, or this tension that's not resolvable, then is like white destiny can't be completed. It can't possibly be completed in the presence of a blackness that also can't be eliminated. So the problem then is not this like universalization at the expense of the other. It's not even that Europe is like, or like the European project is like trying to just like get rid of everyone else. It's that this like white destiny is like necessary to the European project, but it's also impossible. And that impossibility is like the reason why we end up in this situation of like endless and infinite policings and genocides and violence.
Appreciate that. So this question was for Melayna, but you both kind of talk about this, so feel free to chime in, Tia, on this one if you want to as well. But one of the notions you interrogate, Melayna, is this notion of policing's excesses within the metropole are kind of a result of a boomerang effect of colonialism. You even reference Gaza in this context, and Gaza and Palestine are often discussed in this way as kind of a laboratory of policing, surveillance, and counterinsurgency technology. And I should note, I know you wrote this prior to October 7th too, so you were just thinking about that in the long history. Um, which that these technologies and techniques, right, would ultimately make their way back and be used in the United States or Europe, which of course we do see. And so I tend to kind of agree with this notion in some ways of the relationship between the development of these technologies, often in colonial contexts, and then their deployment, often, as I would think about this, is actually similar, I think, Tia, to what you were talking about earlier of internal colonies, right? Of that they get deployed most often and most brutally against, internally colonized groups or Black people within these spaces, Indigenous people, and so on. But perhaps the boomerang effect is not the kind of best way to describe it. So anyway, could you say a little bit about kind of what you're challenging here with this discussion?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think I'm trying to, I suppose, unsettle the narrative. Like, I think more generally, when we look at kind of critical accounts of police power, a lot of the time there is this narrative, like I was saying, that there's this break between pre-modern policing, which is like absolutist, and modern policing, which is like somehow like a narrowed down, limited police power that's just concerned with disorder, right? So there's this relationship. I see there's like a temporal break that gets kind of wheeled out and saying like, yeah, police power like used to be like this like really all pervasive like absolutist thing that then kind of breaks in modernity and becomes something else. And then there's also this idea about excessive police power as appearing in the colony or being used in the colony that then rebounds or boomerangs back to the metropole. So I think there's a kind of double thing going on here where a super like violent, barbaric police power is either like pre-modern or exists in another place, that then has like unfortunate reverberations in the here and now. And I think that doesn't really get us very far in terms of like police power and why and how it's used in the here and now in the ways that it is, if that makes sense. So I think like there's this kind of like origin story that I think I'm trying to unsettle, right? Like I don't think we can just explain police power via this idea of a historical origin, which a lot of like critical accounts of police are now trying to do, in the face of like very kind of like white traditionalist like criminological accounts of police, which is like, oh, they're created in the 19th century in London by Robert Peel. There's a lot of accounts of police power that are like, no, hang on, like we need to talk about the colonial prehistory of police. And yeah, I don't know how much explanatory power it has when we're talking about anti-Black police violence, for example. And I think like, yeah, this kind of desire to see it as something that originates in another time and another place that then rebounds back doesn't get us to the very productive, innovative form that police power takes. Also, the way that it's productive of race itself, right? It's not, and this is where I get to via Denise Ferreira da Silva. Police power isn't responding to racial difference, but rather is creative of it. And I think that means that we can't just uncritically rely on this narrative of like, that like police power is responding to racial others and kind of discriminating against them and being violent against them because of that racial difference, but is actually rather productive of it. And I think, there's also this book by Stuart Schrader, about policing that I've now completely forgotten the name of. Do you
Is
know?
Badges Without Borders, is that what it's called?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one. Where he talks about the limits. He's specifically talking about it in a US context, but he's talking about the limits of this colonial boomerang narrative as well, where it's kind of as though you have this kind of like Western liberal practice of policing that then somehow gets corrupted or like stained by the colonial encounter, right, or by the other, that then kind of infects the, like turns back around and infects the metropole with this like excessive violence. And I think obviously that's a really problematic way to conceive of police violence and what it is, and the fact that it's very much internal to like Western liberal democracies, right? It's not that it goes elsewhere and gets corrupted and comes back and is somehow more violent, but rather that what Western liberal democracy is like requires this police violence, and it's like imminent and internally productive, right? It's not something that exists or is external and then appears inside. Rather, it is the inside, if you like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, I think I think about Orasami Burton's work, Tip of the Spear. But there's this, there is this way that, and Stuart Schrader talks about this as well. But like, within like the realm of counterinsurgency and things like this, like these are very porous things too, right? And there are actors that move in and out of these spaces, but also like that's intentional, right? Like it's like, oh well, you develop these techniques over here in Vietnam, well let's put you here to like work on this problem of countering Black revolution, and so it's like yeah, it's not so much I guess from my vantage point a corruption as a feature, as something that is desired actually to be able to like have this porousness of say, whether it's like CIA to police or, Abu Ghraib to US prison guards to that kind of stuff, and so, yeah, absolutely. Um, so Tracy asked a question which I pull in from the audience. So, is this blackness emphasis phenotypical or more cultural blackness? I think Tia question answered my question by quoting Cabral, but I was just curious. Yeah, if either one of you want to respond to that.
I mean, yeah, it's so I want to take Winter here, I think, who would give us a kind of twofold like way of thinking about blackness. I think one so I'm thinking about like primarily about the function of blackness, and the way that blackness functions as both for Winter, like both the like bottom rung of humanity, and we talked about that in terms of like anxiety around that, and the way that functions like as the kind of the African like savagery and things like this for Hegel, as this like space that we need to kind of mark off and escape and move through, and the way that that's used to kind of to determine things like progress and temporality, because it's like, you know, like captured in a kind of space of like endless like backwardsness and all this kind of thing. But also for Winter, blackness is a kind of a nothing that cannot appear in the world, and therefore functions as a kind of like reservoir for like for like the as like fungibility, I guess, to use like Saidiya Hartman's way of thinking about this. So through which things like freedom and civil society and humanity can be kind of construed and cohere against this like necessary nothingness, which is required to make those things cohere, but then but cannot possibly be part of their actualization.
Yeah, Melayna, I wonder for you, I mean, this is an interesting question because you talked about, you know, through De Silva, like police as kind of a race making project. And so, you know, I wonder like how much the difficulty in answering that question also is because it's defined by defined by police. It's defined by and European philosophers and you know, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think, yeah, like Tia was saying, I think I draw how I'm thinking about this from like, yeah, Hegel, who talks about African and African people as yeah, being this like absolute space of unfreedom, I suppose, and how Hegel kind of extrapolates from that and thinks about, he kind of ends up um ambivalently kind of endorsing slavery. He's sort of saying that, yeah, there's this essentially like sub-Saharan Africa specifically is so like closed off from the rest of the world that like essentially like the dialectic of spirit can't reach them, and then how that plays out. But also, you know, yeah, European philosophy more generally as characterizing blackness as being a state of nature, as Tia was also talking about. I also talk about that. And so I think it's interesting that when you look at like the testimonies of police officers, so Didier Fassin has got this book called Enforcing Order. He did an ethnography of police in France in the banlieues specifically, where they were policing banlieues. And he talks about the police officers talking about entering a jungle and a war zone, and as you know, the people residing there, like, you know, large proportion of black residents there as being yeah, savages and so on. And so you see, we're not just talking about European philosophers describing Black people and Africa in this way, but you see it crop up in like the testimony of police officers themselves. Stuart Schrader talks a bit about that as well. And then the function that that has of, again, you know, if police are operating in this kind of wilderness, this state of nature, then any preemptive violence they then take will then be justified, right? Because they're operating in this like super like lawless place, right? That where anything can happen and they're constantly under attack. And this is literally how they talk about it themselves, right? And that's literally taken verbatim. So then any violence that they then enact was a like necessary, but also like in self-defense, right? Even if it's like preemptive, even if after the fact it's found that the person that they shot and killed was unarmed and couldn't possibly have posed any kind of threat to them.
Right on. Well, I have one more question for Tia, and then if other folks in the chat have any other questions that they want to ask, then we can take a few minutes and try to answer a couple of them. Um, and thanks for that one, Tracy. One of the things you pose, Tia, is that abolition must maintain a perpetual insurgency. In this book, you talk about how so much of harm reduction and community work, what some might call care work, is already co-opted into policing. And I appreciated kind of the way that you're laying this out towards the end of the book. So, can you say a little bit more about what you mean here and kind of why this is?
Yeah. So care is really interesting here, I think, and particularly the way that care work, as you put it, has been like characterized increasingly as an antidote to policing. So this idea that care is somehow inherently a kind of abolitionist practice. We've seen this quite a bit in recent years, and I think that it's important to push back on that a little bit and think about what care is, and in part this is the matter of like the idea of like the sort of perpetual insurgency is a matter of thinking about how things are like roped into political projects, and how that like narrativizing and like bringing into the domain of like the political directs things in certain ways, and just being aware of that process and what that's doing. So for example, in the book, and something I've just been writing about a little bit more actually is an example of the dads on duty. I don't know if people remember this. This was a group of fathers. It was a group of black dads basically in Shreveport in Louisiana, who were like patrolling a school because in the school there'd been a lot of violence, and the police presence in the school was huge, and there'd been a number of arrests, and of course the community is like troubled by this, and so the idea was that the dads would like patrol the school in order to kind of hopefully prevent the violence, and certainly prevent arrests and things like that. So kind of mediating that into that relationship between police and pupil and school and things like this. And I'm quite interested in how that became narrativized. It gained quite a lot of media attention at the time, and it was kind of like written up as like an abolitionist project, right? So it was called Abolition in Practice by a few people, and I'm quite interested in the way that we are capturing something like that, which is an example of care, and in this case, like absolutely necessary example of care to mitigate the harms that these children are facing at the hands of the police. But what are we doing in saying that this is abolitionist? I actually think it's a good example of the limitations of care work as abolition, because the community who's being required to perform the care work do not have the capacity to undo the violences to which they're subjected. So what does it mean to kind of claim this as abolition? I think it's quite important to ask that question. And like even we can think about this, I I think it's quite apparent if we just think about the context of Shreveport a little bit, where the school is located. This is the place that is, its neighborhoods are effectively segregated by a massive highway. The segregation like massively entrenches historical racial boundaries. You can see like life expectancy, earnings, median income, all this kind of stuff is like hugely disparate in these like racialized zones effectively. We can think also about the school as a space of like extrajudicial captivity. We can think about the way that the dads here are like mediating this relationship between pupils and police. They don't, that relationship is not like disappeared. It's simply, there's another layer, and the group of dads, they worked with the mayor, they worked with state police as well. This is not a kind of course, like keeping police out of schools is a very good thing, but it does not abolish the police. And I think it's quite important to think about what it means to co-opt that sort of project to co-opt that act of care, into a political project, and to say that this is one of abolition, because I think it should cause us to think about how it might actually kind of reassure rather than undermine policing. I think that sort of claiming it as abolition makes it into something where it's actually very clear that the people involved don't have the capacity to undo policing. And so that capacity, like claiming it for abolition, almost like reverses the capacity and draws attention to it in some way. It also kind of captures this like act of care within a kind of white fantasy almost of what that political project might be. So yeah, it's the suggestion was kind of drawing attention to the way care is not inherently abolitionist, and I think it's incredibly important to kind of think about care more thoroughly, rather than thinking about rather than thinking that it has this like inherently kind of like revolutionary capacity. And this is just like the most sort of basic idea that our main problem in like neoliberal society was like that we're all individuals, and like society is fragmented, and all we need to do is like get relationships back and be more relational, and it just misses everything about how these processes actually work. So yeah.
I appreciate that. It does remind me a little bit too of Joy James, talking about in some of her, critical commentary on abolition and within the academy and whatnot, the obfuscation of discussions about violence, and like state violence specifically, and that and what it would actually require to you know who's thinking about the plan to defend or move beyond a world, like that these are questions that are often pushed to the sideline or not really seriously engaged. Um, Understandably, I think to some degree, because they're difficult to engage with, because the level of violence that we're talking about is, I think, what we might most point to right now, in terms of Gaza, like thinking about what actually happens when you really engage in a project of trying to transform society, and how is that responded to, and who's viewed as insiders and outsiders in that. And so I think that's that intervention that you're making there around care, I think, is an important one, because I do think care work is incredibly important work, but I think it has to be politicized in a certain way, and it has to be part of a bigger project that is more politically serious and kind of um, probably long term and multifaceted than just so much as, yeah, we can create these local programs, and work with the state, or even if you don't work with the state, how does the state or police, how does what you're doing benefit or undermine what they're doing? I think these are important questions to engage. um, well, uh yeah, Hiram, also appreciate you, Hiram. So much gets labeled abolition within the nonprofit context, and this is also, yeah, I think a really important point to be critical of, right? Is that abolition has become something that can just be a kind of brand that can be added on to what's essentially a nonprofit program or something like that, and um, these things are in place also because of what the state and the capitalist system is not providing for people that they might need and things like that, but it's not actually a solution or a transformative project. um, well, I thank you both for your time on the books today. Is there anything that either of you would like to kind of say in closing or offer up as we close out? But I very much appreciated talking to you both.
Not really. I've just, yeah, it's been great. Thank you so much for having us on.
Yeah, same. I appreciate the chance, and the questions that you asked are really generative. So I appreciate that a lot. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. Again, the books are A Philosophical History of Police Power. Um, and the other one is Everything is Police. And I meant to say this earlier, but I did appreciate your comment on Foucault, because actually when I saw the title, I was like, oh, this is a Foucauldian book. And then like because of exactly the kind of there's like a meme sort of about Foucault about like sort of everything is a prison, right? And so that was kind of, yeah, what I was thinking. But very much appreciate it. Appreciate all of your insights and comments, and I look forward to following your work and see what else you all are working on. And I'll be looking out for that piece on Foucault that you have coming out as well. That'll be interesting to read. All right, thank you both.
Thank you.